You know that idea that God only performs miracles for important people or those already at the top? Yeah, I used to believe that too, until the day he proved me wrong. Who would have thought that while cleaning bathrooms and dusting expensive furniture, I'd find the biggest turning point of my life? It's strange to think that in a place where everyone seemed to have everything, I, the most invisible of all, was the one carrying the true wealth. My name is Adalynn Bridges. I'm 35, I live in Orlando, Florida, and I work as a housekeeper to support my 2 kids. That morning, I was in yet another mansion, quietly singing a prayer while scrubbing the floor, when suddenly I heard, "Who is this God you praise with so much love?" It was the heir of the house, and it was with that simple question that a story began, one that would change not only my life, but his as well. I've always believed that even when the mouth is silent, the heart can still speak to God. That's why, while scrubbing the floor or polishing a piece of furniture, my lips move on their own, singing hymns I learned as a child. The sound echoes through the luxurious hallways, and somehow, I feel that each note carries not only my voice, but also my prayers. It's funny, in these quiet spaces, my faith seems to speak even louder. And between one swipe and another, I realize that praising God is the most beautiful way to turn work into worship. I remember one day when the house was so silent that my own voice seemed like a whisper in God's ear. I sang softly, but every word was full of gratitude, even though my life wasn't easy. You know that feeling when, even without an audience, you're in front of the one who truly matters? For me, that audience has always been heaven, and it was in this habit of praising while cleaning that I discovered something powerful. When the body is busy, the soul is freer to worship. I don't know if you've noticed, but there are jobs the world considers simple, yet for God, they are grand stages. There, amidst the smell of cleaning products and the shine of marble, I experienced moments of deep intimacy with the Lord. Anyone looking from the outside might see just a woman scrubbing the floor, but anyone looking through the eyes of faith would see a warrior turning dust into praise. And it was on one of those ordinary days, with broom in hand and song in heart, that something unexpected began to unfold. There were days when I came home with aching feet, a tired body, and a mind full of worries. Raising 2 kids alone in an expensive city like Jacksonville isn't for the faint of heart. But that's where faith comes in, not just as comfort, but as the only foundation that kept me from falling apart. It was in this tight, demanding routine that I learned, day by day, that overcoming with God isn't just a beautiful idea. It's a practical act, lived in the quiet of the night when bills don't add up and your knees are the only place to rest. I remember one night when Henry, my oldest, asked if we'd have enough food for the week. That question broke my heart. I took a deep breath and said, "Son, God has never failed us." It wasn't just a comforting phrase. It was a testimony of faith built through years of quiet miracles, like the neighbor who showed up with grocery bags without knowing we needed them, or the electric bill that mysteriously came lower during the tightest month. These little victories were reminders that God was always in control. And you know the interesting part? It was precisely when my heart felt shattered that my faith became stronger. I realized that human weakness is the perfect stage for God's strength to shine. I saw myself as a cracked vessel, yet still useful because it was through the cracks that God's light entered. And maybe that's why, even in the midst of scarcity, I could still sing through the hallways of the mansions, because I knew that while I praised, He was already preparing the next provision. Little did I know, this quiet faith was about to be noticed by someone who would completely change my story. It was supposed to be just another ordinary cleaning day. The mansion was quiet, as always, and I lost myself in my usual praise while dusting the library. The smell of polished wood, mixed with the soft sound of my voice, gave me a strange sense of peace. Then, as I turned to grab the bucket, I realized I wasn't alone. Leaning against the doorframe was a young man I had never seen before, watching me with a curious and almost moved expression. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, as if trying to understand exactly what was happening in front of him. I, a little embarrassed, kept cleaning, trying to ignore his presence, but my heart raced. It wasn't common for anyone to hear me sing while I worked, especially someone who seemed to belong to a world so far from mine. Somehow, I felt that this simple, unexpected moment carried a special weight. When our eyes finally met, I realized he wasn't curious about the music itself, but about what it conveyed. It was as if he was trying to decipher something that wasn't in the notes, but in the message behind them. In that moment, without even knowing it, I was sharing a testimony of faith through every verse I sang. And that's when I understood. Sometimes overcoming with God begins to touch hearts even before we say a single word. I just had no idea that that curious gaze was about to turn into a question that would completely change the course of my days. He stepped forward, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of breaking the atmosphere that had formed. His eyes were still watching me with that mix of curiosity and reverence, until suddenly he asked, "Who is this God you praise with so much love?" It felt as if time had stopped. There I was, dusting cloth in hand and heart racing, realizing that this question wasn't just curiosity, it was a silent plea for hope. In that moment, all the worries of my day disappeared. The floor I was cleaning, the week's accumulated fatigue, it didn't matter anymore. I knew this was a rare opportunity, one of those moments the Holy Spirit puts in front of us and that we cannot waste. His question echoed inside me, and I realized that behind it was a void only God could fill. It was as if my praise had been a seed, and now the soil was ready to receive more. I smiled, still surprised, and took a deep breath before answering. My instinct was to speak of love, not religion, of relationship, not rules. Because overcoming with God isn't a rehearsed speech. It's a testimony of faith that comes from real life. And as I began to explain who this God was, the one who had carried me through every step, I realized that somehow this conversation was about to change not only his life, but mine as well. Still in my simple uniform and with my hands smelling of cleaning products, I began to share a piece of my story with him. I spoke of sleepless nights, of whispered prayers so my children would never feel hunger or lack a home. I talked about how, even at my lowest points, I always found a reason to be thankful. As I spoke, I realized it wasn't about impressing him. It was about showing that overcoming with God is real, possible, and often begins in the most unlikely places, even in the middle of dust. Caleb, as I learned his name, listened quietly. His eyes never left mine, as if each word was a piece of a puzzle he was trying to put together. I shared small but meaningful miracles, like the day I found money in the pocket of a forgotten coat just when the fridge was empty, or the time a friend showed up with clothes for my kids without me asking for anything. These little details, which the world calls coincidences, I call divine care. And as I told my story, I noticed something unexpected. My story, which had so often felt simple and even ordinary, was stirring in him a different kind of hunger. Not a hunger for material things, but for answers. It was as if the testimony of faith I carried was opening a path whose destination I didn't even know. And although I had my doubts and insecurities, something told me that this encounter wouldn't end there, and that, in some way, God had already marked the next chapter of this conversation. When I finished speaking, he stayed silent for a few seconds, as if he was still processing everything. Then, with a shy smile, he said, "Would you like to have coffee with me sometime? I want to hear more about this, about your God." I have to admit, I was surprised. It's not every day that an heir from one of Jacksonville's wealthiest families invites a housekeeper for coffee. But I realized that behind that invitation, something bigger was happening. It wasn't just about a conversation, but about a meeting that God Himself was orchestrating. I accepted, though with a mix of curiosity and caution. After all, I didn't know exactly where it might lead. As he talked about where we could meet, I thought about how God has unexpected ways of opening doors. And to be honest, in that moment, the coffee seemed less about the drink and more about the opportunity to keep sowing faith. It was as if the invitation was an extension of the praise he had heard earlier, a next step that didn't depend on me alone. I didn't know much about Caleb, but something in his manner made it clear that he carried deep questions. Maybe it was the restless look in his eyes. Maybe the way he mentioned that he had a lot to understand about life. What I knew for certain was that overcoming with God isn't just about our own story. It's also about what He can do through it in the lives of others. And that simple invitation for coffee seemed like the beginning of something I couldn't yet imagine, but that was about to change both sides of this story. When we sat down for that coffee, I noticed that Caleb carried an invisible weight. He didn't take long to speak, as if he had been waiting a long time for someone who would really listen. He shared that even though he grew up surrounded by luxury, he always felt a hard-to-explain emptiness. He talked about parties that ended in silence, trips that left no good memories, and relationships that seemed more like business than love. There in front of me, he wasn't the imposing heir, but a man searching for answers. As I listened, I realized that his pain wasn't so different from mine, even if our realities were opposite. He had in abundance what I never did: money, financial security, opportunities, but he lacked what I, by God's grace, had in abundance: peace. I reflected on how overcoming with God doesn't depend on what we have in our pockets, but on how much we let Him fill our hearts. And in that moment, my role wasn't to speak, it was to listen. Caleb admitted he had deep doubts about God, the Bible, and even the meaning of life. He said he had always thought faith was for people with no other options, but somehow my story was making him reconsider. I knew it wouldn't be a rehearsed speech that would convince him. It would be truth, patience, and above all, a living testimony of faith. And as the coffee cooled in our cups, I realized that this conversation was only beginning, and that something greater was about to happen in his life. I knew I couldn't answer all of Caleb's questions at once, and that wasn't even my role, but I could show him where I found my own answers. So I took out my Bible, the one I've carried in my bag for years, with marked pages and folded corners, and placed it on the table. I told him, "This is where life starts to make sense, Caleb. No matter how dark it gets, the light always comes from here." I saw his eyes tracing the worn cover, as if he were looking at a mysterious treasure. I shared how, on nights filled with fear or uncertainty, I would open Psalm 121 and read aloud, "The Lord will keep you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand." I explained that this wasn't just ancient poetry, but a living promise, one that had already carried me through painful times and could also carry him. I felt that more than theological answers, he needed direction, a personal invitation to experience God for himself, and that's exactly what I offered. I invited Caleb to come to my church. I told him it wasn't a grand place, nor full of elaborate rituals, but a simple space where ordinary people live stories of overcoming every day. "Come see for yourself," I said. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a small smile, like someone accepting a challenge. I didn't know it yet, but that yes would be the beginning of a change so deep that neither he nor I could have predicted. When Caleb walked into the church I attended for the first time, something about him seemed different. Not just because of the fancy clothes he wore, but because of the attentive and maybe even wary look in his eyes. Our church isn't full of grand displays, but it has a warmth you won't find in mansions. Pastor Adalynn Brooks, with her welcoming demeanor and firm words, greeted him with a smile that spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. It was as if there he could breathe something he had never found in the cold hallways of the wealthy world. The worship echoed with simplicity, and Caleb was visibly moved by the sincerity of the voices singing. I saw a mix of surprise and emotion in him, as if that worship spoke directly to the emptiness he carried. During the message, the pastor talked about hope, transformation, and how God uses ordinary stories for great purposes. I could tell Caleb was absorbing everything, not just with his mind, but with his heart. After the service, he confessed that he had never felt anything like it before. For the first time, faith seemed more than rules and traditions. It was life. And in that moment, I knew we were at the beginning of something much bigger. But, like any journey, obstacles still lay ahead, and the next chapters would not be easy. After that first visit to the church, Caleb couldn't stop asking questions. It was as if a seed had been planted in that once empty heart and was beginning to grow slowly but steadily. I helped him find verses that spoke directly to what he was feeling, like Jeremiah 29:11, which reminds us that God has plans full of hope for us. And together with Pastor Dwight Colton and his friend Ben Wallace, he began diving into the Word, not as a curious observer anymore, but as someone thirsty for answers. I could see a transformation in his eyes that filled me with hope. Faith, which once seemed distant, made up of difficult words and abstract concepts, was now becoming practical and real. Caleb started applying what he learned, changing his attitudes and striving to live each day with purpose. It was inspiring to see that young heir discovering that overcoming with God doesn't depend on status, but on a sincere surrender of the heart, a living, active testimony of faith. But, like any seed, this growth stirred resistance. As Caleb advanced, opposing forces began to appear, ready to challenge the faith he was starting to cultivate. And little did we know, at this early stage, that the spiritual battle ahead would be intense, testing not only his faith, but mine as well. When Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, Caleb's grandmother, learned about his interest in faith and my simple life, her reaction couldn't have been harsher. To her, it was all a distraction, a blemish on the legacy of a family that had always valued status and appearances. She saw our faith as a step backward, a threat to the social order that had long upheld the family's power. In that moment, I realized that overcoming with God also means facing invisible walls built from prejudice and fear of the unknown. Mrs. Whitman used her influence within the family to try to pull Caleb away from this undesired influence. Subtle messages, cutting remarks at family dinners, and even direct attempts to enforce old traditions that denied the path he was beginning to take. As a housekeeper, I often overheard the whispers, but I also learned that in the midst of resistance, God teaches us to persevere with patience and wisdom. Faith, after all, is tested when it seems like there's no support at all. Deep down, I knew that resistance wasn't just directed at me, but at the change God was working in Caleb. And as we fought to keep our focus on what truly mattered, the real challenge was still to come, a confrontation that would shake not only Caleb's heart, but his entire identity. After all, when faith grows, spiritual battles intensify. When Elaine Monroe, Caleb's ex-fiancée, reappeared, I felt the weight of a storm forming on the horizon. She wasn't just bringing memories of the past, she had a clear mission: to pull Caleb away from the faith he was beginning to embrace, and, in the process, push me out of his life. Her words were sharp, her actions filled with manipulation and resentment. It was a moment when overcoming with God had to be more than a nice phrase. It had to become both shield and sword to protect a testimony of faith that was already beginning to bloom. Elaine represented everything Caleb had left behind, the doubt, fear, and insecurity that so often try to trap us. I saw in him a man torn, battling old wounds and temptations that threatened to extinguish the light starting to shine. During those days, I had to turn to the most intense prayers, asking for strength not to step back in the face of the battles approaching. Faith, after all, isn't the absence of struggle, but God's constant presence in the midst of the war. And despite the whirlwind, it was precisely in this conflict that something wonderful began to happen: transformation. Because only when the storm is strongest can the new emerge with greater force. Caleb needed to go through this test to understand that true victory isn't in avoiding pain, but in standing firm, even when the path seems dark. And I was ready to walk beside him, even if it meant facing the worst. Even with all the battles we were facing, I could see small miracles happening in my home, clear signs that God was present and taking care of our story. I remember when Sophia, my youngest daughter, finally stopped having those nights of crying for no reason, and peace returned to our home. Or when, in moments of despair, unexpected help would arrive, sometimes in the form of a donation, other times through the kind words of someone we never imagined. These little acts were living proof that God's work is made up of details that turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. My home, despite its simplicity, began to become a place of hope and renewal. Henry, who had carried the weight of responsibility from such a young age, started to smile more and open up to the faith I'd taught by example. And even on the hard days, when everything seemed to work against us, the certainty of God's care kept me strong. These miracles, even if small by the world's standards, were real testimonies of faith for me and my family. Knowing that God was at work in our home gave me the strength to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for those who had yet to experience this peace. I understood that these signs weren't just for us, but for anyone who might one day hear our story and find hope. Little did I know that these miracles were about to multiply, touching lives far beyond the walls of my home. When Caleb decided to give his life to Jesus, I felt a mix of joy and reverence that's hard to put into words. He who had once wandered, lost among doubts and empty luxury, chose to humble himself before God and be baptized, a clear symbol of the transformation that was beginning not only in his heart, but in his entire world. It was as if overcoming with God had become real for him, a living testimony of faith in action in front of everyone who knew him. I remember the day of the baptism like it was yesterday. The church was full, and Caleb's eyes shone with a new light, the kind of light only someone who has found Jesus can carry. His decision inspired even those who had doubted his change at first. Watching him go down into the water and rise renewed was living proof that when God touches a heart, no social or personal barrier can stop the miracle. It was a defining moment for all of us, a turning point. From that day on, we were no longer just a housekeeper and an heir, but two people united by the same faith, ready to face whatever came next. Yet the journey didn't stop there. On the contrary, a bigger purpose was beginning to take shape, something that would go far beyond just the two of us. After the baptism, Caleb and I felt that God had brought us together for something bigger than ourselves. We decided to work together on a social project focused on single mothers and young people without direction, those who, like me, struggle daily to keep their faith alive despite life's challenges. Seeing that initiative grow was a living reminder that overcoming with God isn't just an individual act, It's a mission that can impact entire communities, transform lives, and reignite hope. I found myself again with a broom in hand, only now with a renewed purpose. Caleb, with his influence, was able to open doors that once seemed closed, but it was our shared testimony of faith that made the real difference. Together, we discovered that regardless of past struggles or social status, God can unite different stories to write brand new chapters of victory. This partnership strengthened us and showed that God's kingdom is for everyone, especially those who carry in their hearts the desire to do good. It was through this work that I realized, once again, that my story as a housekeeper wasn't a setback, but a stepping stone. The testimony of faith I had built not only sustained me, but also inspired Caleb and so many others who crossed our path. And as the project grew, an unexpected surprise was about to change everything between us. One quiet afternoon, while we were talking about the next steps for the social project, Caleb surprised me with a declaration that changed everything. With his shy and sincere manner, he said he wanted more than just a partnership. He wanted to build a life with me, including my children. It was a moment full of deep emotion, because after so many struggles and carrying the weight of responsibility alone, I finally felt that someone truly recognized and valued not just who I was, but my entire story. He wasn't just proposing a relationship, he was offering a union grounded in the faith we both shared. Caleb understood that family was my top priority, and that any future together would have to respect and embrace the love I carried for my children with such devotion. His gestures showed me that God can not only transform individual lives, but also create new homes filled with hope and purpose. As I reflected on his proposal, I realized that God was writing a new chapter, one where two very different stories could intertwine to create something greater. It wasn't just about marriage, it was about building a family and a legacy rooted in faith, love, and perseverance. Little did I know that this invitation to a new life was only the beginning of an even more surprising journey. When we got married, it wasn't just the change of address that marked our new chapter, but the certainty that God was still at the center of everything. The house was new, bigger, and full of possibilities, but what truly mattered was that we remained strong in the faith that had brought us together from the start. For me, that transformation showed that no matter where we are, true strength comes from keeping God as the foundation, whether cleaning a floor or building a home. My children, Henry and Sophia, adapted with a joy that moved me deeply. They didn't just gain a new house, but a father who loves them, and a family walking together in faith. Caleb and I continued serving at the same church because we knew that our spiritual growth was the true foundation for everything we were building. And the most beautiful part of all this is that the testimony of faith we began living together became an example for our community. This new stage of life showed that God doesn't change, even when everything around us seems different. Overcoming with God is a constant journey, and I learned that even in moments of victory, we need to stay humble and steadfast, knowing that He is the center of our home and our story. And as we celebrated this new chapter, a greater mission was calling us to the next step. Today, when I look back, I see that my journey was never just about cleaning houses. It was about touching hearts, including the heart of an heir who found Jesus through my praise. The faith that carried me through the hardest days has become a force that drives not only my life, but also the lives of everyone who crosses my path. Today, I'm more than a housekeeper. I'm a partner in God's kingdom, a living testimony that He can turn the simple into the extraordinary. It's amazing to think how God uses our humblest stories to fulfill His grand plans. The journey that began with whispered prayers among furniture and dust has led me to a new life where I can share overcoming with God, and a testimony of faith that inspires. And this is the very story I want to pass on to my children so they grow up knowing that no matter the circumstances, God is faithful and powerful to perform miracles. There's still so much ahead, and I know this story is far from over. If you're listening, I invite you to reflect. What's your next step in your walk with God? What testimony do you want to leave behind? Here on the Faith Story channel, you have a space to share your life, your struggles, and your victories. How about sharing your story in the comments and inspiring others to find their own overcoming with God?